Everyone, my name is Kathy Tai, and I'm the Deputy Regional Director for Asia at the Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE. Welcome to today's panel, where we will hear from our distinguished speakers on their views about the role of the private sector in the digital economy policymaking process. First, I would like to thank the organizer, Taiwan Internet Governance Forum, for hosting this great event and for providing a valuable platform for dialogue on the policy issues, opportunities, and challenges presented by today's age of digital transformation. At CIPE, our work sits at the intersection of economic development, democracy, and human rights, a very unique position from which we promote opportunities for growth. Many studies have shown that democracy delivers by providing opportunities for people from all segments of society to prosper. A recent study by MIT economist Darun Acemoglu again reaffirmed that democracy is a driver of economic growth. We believe that the private sector plays a crucial role in sustainable and inclusive growth. Technological innovation is a critical driver of growth in today's economies across the world. And we're excited to see how digitalization will continue to give rise to new business models. The goal for today's discussion is to highlight how we can help ensure that these exciting changes spur growth, not just for the well-connected on the right side of the digital divide, but also creating opportunities for everyone. So how can we foster new opportunities to lower barriers to entry and make the digital economy more accessible to small businesses, rural enterprises, and the informal sector? And how do we drive new innovations in the traditional approaches to financing, labor, and trade to make these opportunities a reality? We have operated in this COVID environment for almost 2 years. A lot has happened, and there's much for us to learn from these 2 years. The pandemic has forced us to adapt and has forced us to accelerate the trend of digitalization. When governments enacted lockdowns, employed movement restrictions, or announced stay-at-home orders across the region, for many who were able to, they've moved much of their daily lives online, from how they operated their businesses to how they shopped groceries and communicated with health providers. Since the pandemic began, online data traffic has risen by more than 20%, and the use of communications platforms has more than tripled. Livelihoods and businesses are more reliant on the internet and technology than ever before. We have seen a surge in businesses that adapted to work virtually. In the past, people had doubts about working remotely. Now, they've seen rise in efficiency. While it's true that digitalization has enabled and expanded economic, civic, and democratic participation for many, for those who are unable to utilize the internet to access information, communicate, or engage in e-commerce, they have been further left behind. Prior to COVID-19, many entrepreneurs faced technical and regulatory barriers to digitalization. Today, there's a deeper concern that small businesses are unable to move operations online or unable to navigate regulatory changes. They might not even survive. Within CIPE's Partners Network, some entrepreneurs have adapted and responded to the pandemic swiftly with their innovative ideas, flexibility, and efficiency. Yet, Some are still looking for solutions and are struggling to keep up with the rapid change of digitalization. Democracy requires many different groups to work together, hand in hand. Just like to TWIGF, we're bringing together representatives from government, civil society, international organizations, and the private sector. Regulatory frameworks and policymaking process have opened doors to support more inclusive participation in the digital space. Today's discussion by representatives from the government of the Philippines, Asian Development Bank, Amazon, and think tank in Asia is an embodiment of this necessary, broad-based dialogue that is crucial for democracy to deliver. We all need to work together to ensure that economic dividends are enjoyed by all in this rapidly growing digital space. I want to thank you again for the opportunity to have CYPE here to facilitate this discussion on such an important topic. And it's a pleasure to be here. Over to you, Srijana.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for those remarks. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone in your part of the world, and a warm welcome to our session as part of the Taiwan Internet Governance Forum 2021. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Srijana Herder, and I am a program officer at the Center for International Private Enterprise, and I am based in our representative office here in Manila, Philippines. It is my great pleasure today to moderate our session on the topic of the role of the private sector in the digital economy policymaking process. My colleague, Kathy, summed up some of the most important themes of this discussion, which really center around this question of how can we ensure that the enabling environment for digital transformation is inclusive of a broad section of the economy. The pandemic greatly accelerated digital transformation and the growth of the digital economy. With the expansion and prevalence of digital tools, technologies, and services, we have seen greater adoption, deepening usage, and a paradigm shift in the way that businesses operate and how societies interact. But this acceleration has also amplified many of the elements of the digital divide and existing legal and regulatory frameworks, as well as the compatibility of those frameworks within and between countries, regions, and globally. National and regional policies and regulations that facilitate greater competitiveness and inclusiveness require greater coordination between government, industry, and civil society, as well as targeted collaboration across Southeast Asia and the Asia Pacific. Today's discussion will offer perspectives on how business, civil society, and government can cooperate effectively to advance digitally driven economic growth and inclusive digital transformation, and how they can leverage new flexible approaches to ensure that the enabling environment, including the regulatory and the policy systems in place, will foster more inclusive, accessible, competitive, and sustainable digital economies. So that is our topic today and the conversation that we want to bring to TWIGF. We have a fantastic panel with us today and a great opportunity to get more into these issues. So I'll start off with a bit of housekeeping. Just to go over the agenda, we'll start off with 5-minute presentations from our panelists, as well as opening remarks, and then we will follow that with a panel discussion with questions that I have prepared for our speakers. Following the panel discussion, we'll have a 10-minute Q&A with the audience, and I ask that you please use the Q&A chat box on your WebEx screen to send in your questions, and we'll look to address them. And then finally, my colleague Ryan Evangelista will close us out with some final thoughts. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Today's speakers include Ms. Mary Jean Pacheco, the Assistant Secretary of Digital Philippines and the e-commerce lead at the Philippines Department of Trade and Industry, Ms. Philippa Amanta, Head of Research at the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies, or CHIPS, that is based in Jakarta, Indonesia, Ms. Cynthia Chin, Head of Public Policy for Taiwan and Hong Kong, and Mr. Thomas Abel, Advisor and Chief of Digital Technology for Development at the Asian Development Bank. So I will turn it over to ASEC Jean to begin her presentation and to tell us a little bit more about the Philippines e-commerce plan. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sorry about that. So again, good morning. Greetings from Manila. Thank you, Srijana. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you to the Center for International Private Enterprise for this invitation. Also to thank you to Taiwan Internet Governance Forum 2021. Thank you for the invitation. Let me get on with it right away. The topic is really the role of the private sector in the digital economy policy making process. So I'd like to start off right away that, before I got into the e-commerce sphere, I had been planning officer for the Department of Trade for many years. And the thing that we institutionalized the most is stakeholder engagement. In the Philippines, particularly in the Department of Trade and Industry, we always say, and Ryan knows this, that public-private sector engagement is part of our DNA. We have institutionalized stakeholder engagement. What you see here on the screen is a public participation spectrum by the International Association for Public Participation, which we have taken to heart in terms of policy making. And you see that this is the continuum that we in the Department of Trade and Industry has institutionalized in our policy making bodies. So, but let me go ahead with the topic, which is basically on e-commerce. And of course, when we lay out the policy, it really is for a reason, to put a context, to define the problem. Of course, the good news is that the recent Temasek Google Bain study really did recognize that e-commerce has grown in the Philippines, the highest, in fact, in Southeast Asia, the growth in Southeast Asia. And this is really driven by government initiatives. And we are very happy about that, because this proves that the policy that we have initiated relative to the e-commerce roadmap is, I think, a proof of the pudding. The business registration has drastically increased, but so has the number of consumer complaints. In the Philippines, it's very clear what we always say: you have more mobile phones than we have the population. We are built for e-commerce because we are a young population. We do a lot of social media. We are number one in terms of social media, and the number of internet spent in the internet. So we all need to do what is basic in our mission. And what is that mission? To make sure that we have more buyers we have more sellers online and more buyers buying online more frequently. So we have actually done the roadmap, which is the topic and the focus of the policy making process. The roadmap really identifies 22 strategies and action plans that helped us plot what we need to do to maximize e-commerce. There are also other policy tools that we are currently undertaking in the Philippines, which is a legislation, as well as an ongoing initiative to issue an executive issuance. But let me just go ahead with the roadmap. As you can see, the roadmap has a roadmap. We practically drew the journey. I hope people can see it on the screen, but number one there is engagement. I am a digital immigrant. And what we really need to make sure is that we are able to understand what the ecosystem is. And that's the first thing that we did. So we did the engagement, the process. Even in the process, there's still a lot of engagement there, doing all of the surveys and also key informant interviews with platforms. Every single step of the roadmap, as you can see, has private sector interventions there as well. So very quickly, as I said, one of the things that we need to do as policymakers is to know the stakeholders, and we build a simple ecosystem. We know that e-commerce has the values really on the digital platforms, but it also talks about payment. It talks about logistics, because they are the ones that actually connect the buyers and the sellers. As you can see, I'm just putting everything down very quickly due to time, but we, the private sector, drew this ecosystem for us. They defined the platforms, they defined the payment ecosystem, and also the logistics. So by doing all of that, we were able to understand what is the Philippine e-commerce ecosystem. So each of these members, each of these companies involved in the ecosystem have actually been invited to all of our sessions. So in the roadmap, we started with focus group discussions. The roadmap is hinged on three basic pillars: speed, security, and structure. We were able to build that because of this engagement with the private sector. So we had one when we talked to the payment gateways, we talked to the digital platforms, we talked to the logistics service providers, and then of course with the public sector. But of course that isn't enough. While we have constituencies, we also have thematic issues that govern e-commerce. So we talked about piracy, intellectual property, digital taxation, data privacy, consumer protection, and ease of doing business. And in each of these sessions, we put in the regulator and also the private sector, because we have to make sure that we understand what the problems are, and we come up with corresponding strategies to really remember that really our goal is really to promote the growth of e-commerce. So there, aside from that, aside from the focus group discussions, we also did several more discussions with as we tried to make the roadmap more comprehensive. We really had to do more consultations with whether it's with government agencies like the ICT, the Bangko Sentral, the Philippine Statistical Authority. The last mile delivery platforms is a very important component of the e-commerce ecosystem. We had to do a double take, and also the startup community. So as you can see, I just show you some photos because these are all very dynamic engagements with the private sector. So go ahead, please. These are all engagement, and by the end of we had to stop a little bit because of the COVID. We started in 2019, and then 2020 COVID came, so we did a little bit. We did a little bit more of capacity building for pivoting from offline to online, but we were able to launch this in 2021 of January. So this is a fairly new, an updated roadmap, and it is a short, an immediate roadmap which will end by next year, because e-commerce is very, very agile. So I think next slide. This is what my ending will be. As I mentioned at the beginning, stakeholder engagement is part of our DNA. It is so part of our DNA that we have made stakeholder engagement a key indicator for the Department of Trade and Industry. As I've mentioned earlier on, we do have a lot of policy agencies, and we have to make sure that that there is consultative process and the link with the private sector. After all, the DTI, we are governed by the structures that we have with many councils, private sector and public sector, whether in the area of exports, micro, small, medium enterprises, National Price Coordinating Council, Consumer Affairs. So these are all institutional councils with private sector participation and public meeting together to form policy. So with that, I am very happy to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation, and it would be my pleasure to answer questions later on. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much. I love that presentation, Asek Jean. I've seen it before, but it always kind of blows my mind to see sort of the whole process and the actual roadmap as well. I can't wait to dig more into that a little bit when we get to our panel discussion. I think I'll turn it over now to Philippa. to talk a little bit about sort of the co-regulation of the Indonesian digital economy. Philippa, take it away.
Thank you so much, Srijana. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all participants. Thank you so much for the Taiwan Internet Governance Forum and also for CYBE for hosting this discussion and having me as well. And hello to my fellow panelists and to Asean. Thank you for sharing that. It's really good to be learning a lot from the Philippines experience. So allow me to share a little bit about our experience here in Indonesia. Let me quickly share my screen. So as we all know, the digital economy has really skyrocketed the past couple of years, accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And Indonesia is one of the largest and will be the largest digital economy in Southeast Asia. Just in 2021, the total global merchandise value for the sector has reached $70 billion. That is a 49% growth from last year. And that is driven largely by activities in the e-commerce, which grew 52% from last year. And because the mobility restrictions have urged everyone to move all of the daily activities online, Indonesia also saw about 21 million new digital consumers in 2021 alone. Even for existing consumers in the digital economy, the activities and the transactions of goods and services online has also tripled in 2021. So this is just to share the scale and the size of the policy areas that would require a sound regulatory framework, because there is so much benefit and growth, especially to economic opportunities and to market access and to inclusive financial opportunities. But also at the same time, there are lots of risks, especially on existing digital inequities or fraud or violations of personal data privacy or violations of digital rights and digital access. So a sound regulatory framework is really necessary, but how is the ultimate question? Because policymakers have to face challenges of rapid innovation that often exceeds the pace of policymaking process. And then they also have to deal now with cross-border value generation and data transfer. So the policy issue cannot just be limited within the domestic policy discussion, but you have to engage with international audiences, international companies, and other governments as well, not to mention the scope and scale of businesses and the emerging social risks. So far, the traditional regulatory approaches have been either state-controlled or self-regulation, which means a top-down control by the state or leaving it for the private sector to regulate themselves. But what we think we're proposing would be a co-regulation, which is a blend and a mixture between state-controlled and self-regulation that balances giving freedom and giving some degree of autonomy to companies, but at the same time having supervision and control by the government. So co-regulation emphasizes the sharing of responsibility between state and non-state actors in policy making, enforcement, and evaluation. The benefits of co-regulation is that it really addresses the asymmetric or incomplete information, because policymakers are not embedded within the ecosystem. And then it allows for flexible adoption of solutions, which are emerging very, very rapidly with new products, new services that came into town. And it also facilitates regulatory enforcement, because it shifts the responsibility a little bit from policymakers who has limited resources to the private sector themselves or the associations and civil society who have broader and much more resources at hand to facilitate enforcement. But it does have some disadvantages, because they can be a bit more costly and you have to think about the participation and also the evaluation later on. In more practical terms, co-regulation tools can look like a public-private dialogue, something like what Asean mentioned earlier with that FGDs with the private sector, or it can also be in the form of regulatory sandbox, which gives the private sector a room or space to experiment sort of with their new products and services under supervision from the government. And that has been adopted in Indonesia to some extent. So our central bank and our financial services authority has given the space, providing the space for a regulatory sandbox for new e-payment services, where new companies, new startups can try out their innovations, try out their technology within a safe environment under supervision from the government. They've also acknowledged the association's role in supervising fintech companies. So now associations will regulate their members in terms of what kinds of information must be in the terms and conditions or credit rates and any other business standards, industry standards. And then last but not least, we also have public-private dialogue to design e-commerce regulation and the currently ongoing discussion of personal data protection bill. So the government have invited a broad range of stakeholders from private sector and from civil society, academics, and think tanks to be involved and inform the development of these policies. But still, a significant regulatory gaps still exist. For example, in terms of cybersecurity and consumer protection, which must be continuously addressed. So just to recap, our policy recommendations is really to strengthen and to start to adopt this co-regulation approach across the board, across the different sub-policy areas that really are building the digital economy infrastructure. And that starts with integrating public-private dialogue in policymaking process, ensuring that the public-private dialogue are continuous, inclusive, and also effective. And we are also encouraging the increased use of regulatory sandbox, not just in financial technology, but also on data privacy, on content moderation, or any other policy issues. But that has to be accompanied with a clear scope of responsibility and also having some level of flexibility to adopt the regulatory framework. And last but not least, this whole process is an iterative process, and it should be continuously monitored and evaluated to come back and inform the policymaking process again to result in better and better policy for the future. This is just a short snip from our research papers, which we titled Co-Regulating the Indonesian Digital Economy. And with that, I look forward to our discussion later on. Thank you so much. Back to you, Sujana.
Thank you so much, Philippa, for that overview. It's a great look at sort of the policy paper and the research that you've done. So also looking forward to asking you some follow-up questions on that. Now I'll turn it over to Cynthia.
Hey, can you hear me well?
Yes, can hear you.
Okay. Yep. Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning and a very warm welcome and greeting to you all. This is Cynthia Chin. I'm from Amazon Web Services. I'm based in Taiwan, Taipei, and I oversee the public policy in Taiwan, Hong Kong. And today, actually, I will begin with a heartfelt thanks to TWIGF to hold this meaningful event, and to CYP for inviting me joining this panel together with the distinguished panelists. Back to the topic that I'm going to share today. Let me go to next slide. Okay. Existing policy tools and governance frameworks has been constantly challenged by the rapid emergence of the digital economy, leaving policymakers and regulators challenged in an arms race of applying knowledge to try and stay up to the date with the pace of change. And tackling such a vast subject of 5 minutes in 5 minutes is really a tall order for a private sector practitioner. So let me make an attempt by asking two simple questions. What are the attributes of digital economy policy making? and how can private sector best contribute in the co-regulation policy-making process? I do not have all the answers. However, I would approach these questions with 3 keywords: culture, organization, and mechanism. Let me start with the culture. A lot of biggest challenges for government to transform into a digital economy aren't technical issues. They're about people and culture. The biggest differences between governments and enterprise alike are about talk about going digital, and those that actually do it and are having the most success often comes down to a few key things. First of all, the senior leadership team needs to be aligned and truly committed, and then they need to set in clear direction and expectations to get everyone on the same page and working towards the same thing. It's easy for others to do nothing or block things if the leadership team isn't making the move a priority and building a culture for change. Then, from what we have observed, the most successful government or enterprises going digital started with an aggressive top-down goal that motivate the organization to move faster than it would have organically. This would drive consistency in the policy-making process and to empower officers at all levels of the government to keep the citizen at the center of policy and regulatory decisions and keep accountable. Third, it's really important that the government has a continuous capacity building culture to reskill and upskill with the digital competence and comfortable with the concepts as part of the whole process. Secondly, I would like to touch upon the organization a little bit. For the policymaker, the opportunity cost in decision-making and resources allocation changes substantially, as do the social development and economic growth target that can be set. For regulator, a mindset shift becomes the fundamental requirement, moving from risk manager to development enabler. Organization is the bedrock of the change engine. In contrast to the vertical-oriented government organization design, policymaking in the digital paradigm often involves multiple disciplines which require cross-agency coordination to set forth overarching digital policies that are forward-looking, balanced, and ensure a level playing field. To embrace this trend, many jurisdictions have established designated government agency to govern cross-ministry policy or subject matter authorities, such as digital ministry to oversee digital policies or data protection agency that supervise the application of the personal data protection law. And finally, regarding the mechanism, actually is the process that help turn inputs into the right output to address a recurring process policy challenge. They allow government agency to scale to help officers operate beyond their direct line of sight and to facilitate innovative thinking. The traditional top-down legislative process is somehow being challenged. The policy-making process in the digital age is not sequential, but interlinked, interdependent, and experimental. The parties that are most affected by policy decision, particularly citizens and businesses, need to become active participants in the process. They are the true stakeholders. To reinforce policymaking and supervisory legislations, both analytical capacity and delivery capacity are evolving. In terms of the analytical capacity, there has been a mechanism in practice for years where administration take task force approach and assemble groups of officials, academia, and lawyers from different institutions and disciplines for problem solving. in a closed-door forum. But in the digital paradigm, administration may wish to consider drawing on external insight from industry specialists and from stakeholders to explore the advantage of co-design in conjunction with the existing consultation process. On the delivery capacity, the flexibility to develop and adapt implementation solution to serve policy objectives, meet the needs of citizens and businesses, and maximize cost-effective at the same time. A broader application of the bottom-up driven experimental policy instrument such as sandbox or any other form of co-production are highly encouraged. To sum up, I can give you the example of the Taiwan government. Actually, right now, the Taiwan government is in the preparatory stage of establishing a Ministry of Digital Affairs, in brief, MODA, and is expected to be listed in the first quarter of 2022. The industry applauds government's efforts. And from our understanding, the MODA will encourage private sector participants join force in the co-regulation process, which is encouraging to the industry. And we look forward to work with the MODA and broader stakeholders to contribute to shape the digital culture, participate in the establishment of a dialogue mechanism going forward. With that, I look forward to our further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for that great sort of overall framework. That was a fantastic attempt at fitting everything into 5 minutes. I just took down so many good insights that you shared, and I can't wait to ask you some more questions about that in our panel discussion. I'll turn it now to our last panelist. Thomas, take it away.
Shrujana, and thanks for TWIGF and CYP for inviting me, and thanks everybody for joining. So I'm not going to use slides since we have just a little bit of time. I'm going to talk a little bit about what ADB is doing in the internet and digital economy sector. So ADB is based in Manila, and we're a regional development bank. We provide lending and grants and technical assistance to developing member governments and the private sector across the region to meet our development objectives, which, basically are an inclusive development, covering everything from poverty and inequality to climate and gender. And we have a tremendous effort in basically setting up our development agenda and making sure that all of our efforts are aligned with that and that we can support our member governments and other clients effectively. And the unit that I lead is relatively new, because ADB started many years ago as mainly an infrastructure bank. So we were mostly funding traditional infrastructure like railways and roads, transport systems, energy, those sorts of things. And as everybody has seen, the digital technologies have evolved to where they're really essential in all of our development activities. So a few years ago, ADB set up a new unit that's focused on digital development that I'm leading. And, this is something that's I would say, growing every year, becoming more and more important as part of our activities. And, we basically provide assistance to governments in the digital area. And that could range from, doing a knowledge support, a knowledge product with them, or supporting a pilot of certain technologies, or just supporting a study to figure out the best way to implement some kind of technology. And we are basically seeing that there's more and more demand, especially with the COVID pandemic, that the digital economy has come to the forefront. It's been accelerated tremendously, and now everybody's scrambling to develop a new digital strategy. And I think also some of the I would say the optimism about technology that we had been seeing, say a few years ago has been tampered down now because of the issues we're seeing with privacy risks and security risks, cybersecurity risks. These are also now becoming things that are, very important for our development agenda. As a team, we try to cover all aspects of development and supporting, our member governments in anything from how to improve existing programs with technology to how to upgrade policy processes and policies to improve access to the internet. And we have 4, I'd say, top priority areas. One is connectivity itself. Our president in the past couple of years has put this as one of his top 5 priorities, which is helping to bridge the digital divide. And I think everybody agrees that the pandemic has shown that it's even more urgent to bridge the digital divide now. And, we know that most of the investment in connectivity is with the private sector. GSMA and ITU have estimated that the private sector spends about $200 billion a year on internet infrastructure. And, our lending and all the development bank lending is very small compared to that. So we have to make sure that we're investing in the right way that can move the needle compared to where the private sector is. And this is where, our relationship with the private sector really is very important, because we have to support our governments, but yet also understand, where the private sector can't be as effective as we can be. And in internet connectivity, it could be areas like submarine cables or policy regulations. We even invested in a satellite operator a couple of years ago, which was a very innovative thing. So we're really trying to push on the idea that in order to get to closer to 100% internet access, it's really going to take more than just the current say relationships and private sector model, because even though we now understand how important it is, we still have in the region almost 50% of the people who are still unconnected. And the second half of the digital divide is going to be a lot harder to connect than the first half was. And if you look at that $200 billion that the private sector is spending, probably 75% of that is on 5G, and 5G is going to really improve what you can do with connectivity, but it won't necessarily reach the unconnected as effectively. So there may be requiring new ways of looking at it. And that's something we're very interested in. The second area that we focus on is e-government. We do a lot of work with governments to upgrade and support their digitization, because they need to serve their citizens more effectively. And as citizens come online and businesses come online, governments have to also come online. So we do a lot of work in that area with platforms for social protection systems, healthcare systems, all kinds of e-government service platforms. And I think this is something that governments need a lot of help with, because they often don't have the capacity to implement the systems like the private sector does. The third area that we focus on is Earth observation, which is basically a partnership we have with various space agencies. Satellite imagery is very important for development, because it's kind of a source of big data and a source of knowledge that can drive all kinds of development activities, from how to plan new infrastructure, how to identify, where there are environmental challenges. Satellite imagery is a great resource for that. And we're trying to introduce that across all of our government programs to use it more effectively. And then the fourth area that we focus on is startup ecosystems. We believe that the digital economy is especially facilitated by a robust startup ecosystem. We know that startup companies are in some ways the most effective way of building capability within our developing member countries. And there's a tremendous interest across developing countries to be able to build homegrown technology capabilities, and startups are among the best way to do that, because you're really drawing people right out of university who have the latest education to start companies that are much more fast moving than traditional companies, and can succeed or fail quickly. So there's a faster learning cycle, and we think that's really important, and more important in the development sector, where startup companies are going to be needed even more, because even though they may not have the chances to become the unicorns and the decacorns, we think there's a tremendous gap of investment opportunity in startup companies that are focused on development missions. And we just launched this year ADB Ventures, which is actually investing directly in tech startups across the region that have a development focus aligned with our mission. So we think that this is always a representative of the right balance between public and private sector. And we also have a department of public-private partnerships that works with governments to effectively set up public-private partnerships, so that we can leverage leading practices across the region and make sure that public-private partnerships can be structured to be effective and sustainable. So I think I'll stop there, Shuran, and hand it back to you. And thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Thomas. That was a great overview of sort of the main priorities that the Digital Technology for Development Unit is looking at. And I would love to ask some more questions. We'll actually jump right into the panel discussion now. So my first question is actually for all of the panelists. So I'll ask all of you to respond very quickly, maybe like a 2 or 3 minute answer each. And it's really about the speed at which technology changes. And several of you touched upon this. So we know that technological innovation moves incredibly quickly, much faster than bureaucratic policymaking, legislative reform, and often before regulations can be implemented or fully enforced. So I'm curious, from your various perspectives, are there opportunities for more iterative, flexible legal and regulatory frameworks that allow for businesses and governments to adapt essentially to this rapidly technology landscape in real time? And I'll ask, maybe in the interest of time, I'll ask Thomas for you to go first, and then followed by Philippa, Asik, Jean, and Cynthia. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say there's not a miracle answer here. This is always going to be an issue. And you can see that hands-off approach has been used in some places, and just say, okay, let the technology run wild, like maybe what we've seen in the crypto ecosystem, and then wait until you see major failures and then jump in. But I think that the best example is in the fintech space with central banks and treasury ministries, where they do the regulatory sandboxing. And that's just a great example, because basically, a fintech wants to do something that maybe the finance regulators would be uncomfortable with. But if they're a partner from the beginning and they're sharing, it really can work. But I don't think that's the only model, because there's a need to enable innovation, but it's important for the policymakers to just be able to understand when the innovation is real and when it's not. And you saw like this Wirecard example in Germany, some of these startups that are claiming to be very innovative may be just, fraudulent. And if you don't have enough of oversight to find that, you can create major problems. So I do think that governments need to build up more capability and bring in people with tech skills into into government positions and do maybe some trade-offs, where people are moving back and forth between the regulatory side and the innovation side, and that can also help, although sometimes it's hard to get people to move back and forth. So thanks, that's my 2 cents.
So yeah, that's a really good question, Srijana, and good example also from Thomas. I think I'll add another example from Indonesia, which is on personal data privacy regulations. So I want to emphasize what Srijana mentioned, flexibility, which I think is the key word here. The personal data protection bill in Indonesia has been designed and discussed since early 2020. And now we're approaching the end of 2021, and the bill has not been passed yet. So it's still continuously in discussion in the parliament. And that just goes to show you how long it takes for policymakers to agree and to come up with regulations, which makes sense because, of course, you cannot design policies just like that. You have so many considerations. But within that time period, of course, you have so many other startups that just emerged in the space who leverages on data for their product innovations and services. So you have the lending companies who are leveraging on unique data processing to support the Know Your Consumer or your eKYC efforts to then be able to provide loans to the unbankable consumers and customers, for example. So during that space, then there are concerns that the personal data protection bill may not be adequate or sufficient enough to catch up with all of the new innovations that are happening within that time period of discussion. Hence, you kind of, that point of flexibility and adaptability is important to be embedded in the regulatory framework itself, so that, of course, you need the regulatory umbrella, but that regulatory umbrella is broad and general enough so that you can adapt that to new innovations moving forward, whether it's through regulatory sandbox, whether it's through self-regulation from the associations in conjunction with governments, whatever it is. So you'll sort of regulate the technicalities of, okay, what kinds of data are classified in certain ways, or how can you process data in certain ways that can be left onto some of the more technical regulations instead of that broad regulatory umbrella.
Ethic, Jean, Cynthia.
Okay. Of course, I'd agree right away with what Thomas said, so I won't repeat that. The very good practices of the central banks, including our very own Banco Central, relative to the regulatory sandboxes, would be a practice that we can all agree that it is quite useful. But let me just also very clearly say that in the case of policy making, we in government are very we are very particular about unintended consequences, right? And that's something that we are very much aware of. On the other hand, there are certain issues and that need to be addressed, given our very old, obsolete rules and regulations that have been drafted at the time when there was no internet at all. So that needs a review. In the case of what we are doing right now in the Philippines, we cannot discount the value of dialogue and a very strong engagement process as we move along in updating all of this laws and regulations. We cannot discount the importance of regular the private sector, hearing them out, but at the same time also because there are conflicting views in even this in the sector, in the industry itself. So that makes the role of government really quite significant. And if we all work here together, because we all want to go and want to achieve the same things, then I think really there is a great deal of opportunity, positive views that we can do with to get all of our goals to promote e-commerce and the digital economy in general.
I appreciate this is a great question, which pretty much echoes back to what I have shared just now. Probably I can dive a little bit deeper on what I have been talking about. I also want to echo to Thomas and other speakers regarding the sandboxing. Perhaps I can give an example on the Taiwan FSC Financial Supervisory Commission's fintech regulatory sandbox. The sandbox actually provides a fintech space whereby the fintech startups can experiment their products and ideas and business model in that fintech space, and also the government also recruited the professional law firms to provide on-site consultation to those fintech startups, so that they understand what it takes to prevent future potential unexpected or unwanted risk in terms of the financial services. And also through these kind of processes, the regulator also start to learn what are the new business model, new services that could be applied, and then looking backwards to revise the regulatory framework. So this kind of experimental practices that is actually undergoing in Taiwan in the financial space, and this best practices has been overarchingly adopted by other ministries as well. Say, for example, for the automatic vehicle sandboxing, and then the new Ministry of Digital Affairs, MODA, is also I heard from the team that they will also adopt the sandbox mechanism in the future. So this kind of practices is actually can be diversified and also help the government to better understand what is going on in the industry, and then that can also help the development of the economy. And in terms of the, however, I think there is also one thing very important, which is the continuous capacity building and reskill and upskill of the government officials. Oftentimes the technical expert join the meetings, etc. But sometimes if the gap of understanding is there, then sometimes it's quite difficult and challenging to get to the common consensus. So I think building some kind of common understanding in terms of the digital technology and the risk and the advantage of the technology might put everyone on the same page in order to have a more constructive discussion. And probably that can solve some of the issues that was mentioned just now, that sometimes there are conflicting views, but at the end of the day, these conflicting views may comes from different understanding of the technology. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much all for those insights. I want to turn to you, Philippa, because I feel like all of our panels, you shared such great insights about the importance of flexibility, adaptability, and this co-regulation approach. But I'm curious, Philippa, like how does we talk? Trust is so important, right, between governments, businesses, civil society. So how does the co-regulation approach build this trust, and what mechanisms are needed to facilitate that process?
Absolutely. You're absolutely right, Srijana. Trust is such a key ingredient. I think in Indonesia, even though what I said earlier, 21 million people are now joining as new digital consumers, we still have millions of other Indonesians who don't really trust the digital economy because they perceive e-commerce and e-payments and are associating them with fraud or with, for example, unreliable product quality or fraud or personal data violations in e-commerce or in lending. So these lack of trust would limit e-commerce and fintech penetration. And I'm not also just thinking about trust at the consumer's level, but trust between government and private sector, for example. We also sometimes see a lack of trust between those parties. For example, perhaps policymakers might feel like, might not trust the companies enough for them to act the right way or a certain way to protect consumers. And likewise, perhaps the companies are also not trusting of the policymakers enough that they're creating this regulatory framework with good intentions. So the co-regulation approach puts forward communication as the key aspects in all of the approach, whether it's through the public-private dialogue or stakeholder engagement or regulatory sandbox, because this may sound a bit basic, but communication is really the key to foster trust between people. And without good communication, without meaningful communication, you don't really learn from each other and you don't really understand each other's point of view or perspective of the company's eagerness to innovate or the policymakers' concern with specific issue areas. So communication fosters that linkages and that transfer of information to reduce information asymmetry so that all of the stakeholders involved can work together towards creating a flexible, adaptive, and sound regulatory framework.
Thank you so much, Philippa. Jean, just because we talk a lot about sort of, Philippa mentioned communication is so important, and in your presentation, you emphasized that engagement was, the cornerstone kind of this process. I want to ask my next question to you, which is that what were some of the lessons learned that you got from this engagement process, and how do you see sort of the role of small, medium enterprises or even micro, small, medium enterprises, and how did they contribute to the development of this roadmap, and how can the government sort of really focus on sustaining their digital transformation?
Okay. Thank you. And, Philippa, I'd like to you sort of build from that on the communication issue you actually also just mentioned. The roadmap, part of the success, I'd like to say it as a success, simply because the roadmap is a roadmap that I am proud to say that really prepared by the private sector and the public sector. So I think that in itself is what I can call a success when people, especially those in the private sector who are the drivers of growth, support that. So we prepared a tagline. It's called Basta e-commerce madali. I don't know if Thomas will understand Tagalog, having stayed in Manila, but madali and also sure, but madali is easy. If it's e-commerce, it's easy. It's convenient. That's the message that we wanted. But we also put a thing on the madali to mean market access, digitalization, and logistics integration. So I go first with your last sentence, private sector and for sustainability. So these are the focused areas. Market access, digitalization, and logistics integration. So when you say market access, what do we do for SMEs? We need to help SMEs take advantage onboarding to platforms. We cannot overemphasize the importance of the role of platforms. If you have the likes of Lazada, Shopee, with 50 million users in that platform, then that's a lot of market for our small and medium enterprises. digitalization is equal. We need to we are monitoring our SMEs and trying to categorize them. We do not offer a one size fits all. We have SMEs who don't even know how to use the email for businesses. They can use the phone for social media and Facebook, but they don't do it for business. So there's training for that. There are those who are already in selling in the platforms, in the marketplaces. There's another training for that. And logistics integration as well. We are now already talking about the supply chain, and this is very important. This is critical to the success of e-commerce. Again, the private sector here are leaders. They tell us this is what government, we need to facilitate ease of doing business where, then we do it. So this is really, it's very engaging process. We learn from the private sector because they know the industry the most. And we learn from them, and also at the same time, we government, we try to collaborate with them. So basta e-commerce, madali.
Thank you so much, Asek Jean. And on that note, I might turn to our private sector representative. Cynthia, I mean, Amazon is one of the largest platforms ever. And I think you feel free to speak both from your perspective on, as the representative for Amazon, but also in general, your thoughts on the private sector. I am curious how, in the regions that you've covered, how did the business community really adapt to the virtual landscape? How did they cope, pivot, support their, support sort of the smaller local medium enterprises as well? And then also the second part to that is how did you sort of work with the government to influence, some of the policymaking in support of more inclusive transformation? I think you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you for the question. Probably let me start with the Taiwan. Taking Taiwan as an example. Actually, Taiwan is one of the most advanced and high penetration of broadband infrastructure, and is highly connected for decades, I'm sorry. And then Taiwan is often called a tech island with robust tech ecosystem and startups, which is known as a indispensable partner in the global supply chain, such as semiconductor, ICT product, or software services, etc. So the digital literacy or competency of the industry is pretty high. And then, a lot of times that the government, when we are talking to the government is quite understanding. We do have the common language because the government is well established to foster the tech industry, and our tech industry is really about foreign trade. It's about being part of the global ecosystem. Therefore, most of the industry policy are pretty much open. However, and also secondly, regarding your question, how the government is supporting SME, but actually Taiwan's industry sector is composed by, I would say more than 90% are composed by SMEs. So government has never been, ever been put a lot of resources to foster the, we call it hidden hero kind of SMEs. As a private sector cloud platform company like AWS, actually the cloud infrastructure and the tools and the product and services who offered in the cloud actually can very effectively and efficiently support the SME to grow. So the government is never shy to work with the cloud service providers, including AWS, to cultivate the SMEs in many areas, including we providing educational programs like AWS Educate program, or we have training and certificate programs, providing a lot of training to the workforce, to all kinds of sectors, and to fintech startups, etc. So actually in that space, we are pretty much well aligned with the government agenda and collaborate with the government very closely. However, to your second question regarding how we influence the government, I would say, with the very vivid startup or the enterprise sector in the fast adoption of the cloud technology, sometimes the government has some FUD, I mean fear, uncertainty, and doubt regarding the security of the cloud and the data access issue, etc. So typically, we need to communicate with the multiple agencies in order to better communicate and, like I said, to build capacity with the government agency, government officials who may not be very familiar with the new technologies such as cloud or AI, so that they have better understanding how to supervise related applications, such as in the financial service sector or in regulated industries such as the public sector. We see initially there are some challenges there, but Taiwanese government has been pretty much accessible, so we don't find too much trouble to have a dialogue, constructive dialogue with the government. But like I said, in the beginning, cultural change and reskill, upskill, and build up a constructive, continuous dialogue mechanism structurally probably would help our public policy advocacy moving forward.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for sharing those insights. I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to do a lightning round of questions, and I'm going to ask, I might combine some of the questions I have for you. So I'll start with you, Thomas. ADB is really evolving to become more of a knowledge bank as the development challenges in the region are becoming more and more complex. Can you speak a little bit about ADB's knowledge work in the digital economy? So in particular, common challenges and barriers.
I think we lost her.
Oh,
you're back. Okay. Oh no. I know she's coming in and out, but let's give it just a second. I think she'll probably come back. Yeah. It's a bad time for it to go out.
I could take over for now while we're waiting for Sujana to come back. Hello, everyone, and I hope you're well. Thanks again to our panelists. We're waiting for Sujana to come back, but I'm here to assist. My name is Ryan, and I'm going to close out the session in a bit, but we can continue our discussion in the meantime. And as Sujana aims to go through one by one with respect to other questions that we have, I could probably take over for now. And maybe I could start again in asking some questions to our panelists in respect to the last round of questions. Thomas, I think Sujana wanted to ask you the role of regional bodies or multilateral cooperation in digital economy issues and standardization, for example, on data infrastructure and regulation, as well as different issues on inclusion. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, we actually have a strong focus on this because we invest in infrastructure, but infrastructure also requires a lot of policy support. So, to make it inclusive, to make it sustainable. And in the digital world, that's also happening. And we're doing a lot of work to make sure that governments can promote universal access and shared infrastructure. For example, we build a lot of roads and water systems, and we're trying to do more shared connectivity. So when you build a road or a power line, you actually put in fiber with that. And a lot of our governments, it's a very complicated thing. It takes kind of a public-private partnership, because who's going to own the fiber if it's a part of a road right of way for the, you have different government ministries involved. It's very complicated. The other thing is a spectrum policy. That spectrum licensing is super complicated, and it really takes a very forward-thinking government to do a great job of that. And we're trying to do more in those areas to basically promote a more rapid build out of the internet.
Thomas, and as we look into the different activities of ADB, I'm sure in the next years or so, we're going to see more of these investments coming along, and the role of ADB is certainly very important as a multilateral body to support more infrastructure, as you said, and access to digital tools and technologies. I'm not sure if Sujana is back. Are you back, Sujana? Would you like to continue?
Yes, hi. It's very, timely that this would happen when we're talking about the digital economy and connectivity. So apologies, and thank you so much, Ryan, for stepping in. Thank you so much, Thomas. I think I'll do just two more questions. So Philippa, I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about some of the common risks or barriers that are present when you talk about taking a co-regulation approach, and how might you overcome these?
Sure. Thank you so much, Sujana. So just quickly, I think there are, of course, a lot of risks, but I would highlight two at this point. The first one is about representativeness. So when we're talking about co-regulation approach, we also have to think of who is it representing and who is participating and involved in that shared responsibility and shared policy-making process. Is it only large multinational companies that have resources to access the policymakers, or does it also allow room for startups and small enterprises or civil society organizations to be represented in that co-regulation approach? And this includes, I think, people as well, when you are disaggregating it into communities for women or for marginalized communities, or for people with disabilities, or for people in rural areas without any access to internet. Are they represented, and how can they be involved in co-regulation? So that is a huge risk at the moment, whether or not the process can be democratic and representative. And then the second one is also the risk is of the quality of the co-regulation approach, because unfortunately, sometimes it can also become sort of like a checklist that policymakers just say, tick, we had that discussion in that hotel or in that ministry office, check, we met with so-and-so people and have a huge list of people that we talked to. But to what extent are those informations or those insights from the participants in that dialogue are really incorporated to the policy? That is another question, because there are often risks that people just take dialogue at face value and hold it just for checking it off the list and just to fulfill some kind of requirement for the policymaking process, but not really taking it seriously and taking it as a meaningful exercise to build towards the policymaking process as well. So I think those two are the broader, bigger risks that are obvious.
Thank you so much, Philippa. I just keep going back to Asek Jean's the engagement process again that you shared, as well as Cynthia, when you talked about how policymaking needs to be interlinked, interdependent, and experimental. You need to have that, allow for that when you're talking about policymaking.
Yes.
Yeah, if I may have a follow-up comment to Philippa, and also what you mentioned about the interconnectedness of the engagement, etc. Regarding the representativeness, a lot of people are not aware and is pretty much surprised about the breadth and the depth of the public policy work that we are doing here as a cloud service providers. Like I said, that there are a lot of SMEs and startups running on cloud service providers platforms. And then for some of them, they are encountering, some kind of a regulatory challenges. Like I said, the example of a fintech space. And actually, we work very, very closely with the our customers who are putting up their projects and experiment in the fintech space. And sometimes when they encounter regulatory issues, then they will come to us and we discuss and we collect multiple SME or startups issues, and we talk to the regulator on their behalf. You might be surprised how it works, because like you said, that SMEs and startups typically do not have such resources to do so, and then they may not have a very sophisticated legal counsel to provide consultation. So what we do is, from a very much customer obsessed approach, listen to our customer and provide them suggestion, consultation, and then help them to comply with the regulation. And then when there are issues or difficulties, then we talk to the regulator, sometimes together with our customer, sometimes collect multiple customers' voices and talk to the regulator. So we try to balance out a little bit the disparity of the resources here, and in order to help our customers. Yeah, this is just an add-on practice that probably I can share with everyone here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. I know we're running close to time, and I do want to make sure we have some time for questions and answers. Would you be able to message it to me? If that's possible. Oh, go ahead. That's okay. Go ahead and read it out. That's fine. Thank you so much, Mike, for reading that out. Thomas, I know you addressed this a little bit, but this is actually quite a broad question. So maybe we could hear some thoughts from each of our panelists, and we'll start. Anyone can jump in.
If I may jump in, Sujana, because I think this is highly relevant for Indonesia. Because, well, starting now and going over next year, Indonesia will be the president for the G20 summit. And I know that digital transformation will be one of the three major priority areas that we want to discuss in the G20 presidency. So that is, I think, one example of the role of a multilateral cooperation organization to provide a space to discuss and perhaps hopefully also facilitate some kind of international cooperation or agreements on specific issues relating to digital economy. There's also other examples like the ASEAN e-commerce agreement, which was passed, I think, this year, and then also ratified by its member states, that also facilitates some of like the cross-border cooperation as well. That's something I can share. Thank you.
Yes, I also do agree. I also was about to mention the ASEAN e-commerce agreement, which Philippa mentioned. And as of now, the Philippines is pursuing the UN e-commerce convention, the Electronic Commerce Convention. We are working on that as well to be ratified as an agreement.
Just jump in and say that, you know, there are so many, it's hard to even keep track, but I think that another thing that happens is you have examples like the GDPR in Europe that becomes kind of a template, and it's not something that's forced upon, but because it seems to have gotten some traction there, a lot of people kind of, other governments pick that up and take, you know, maybe modify it for their own needs. And so there's a lot of that as well. And then there are many sub-regional groups. ADB sponsors some of them, Central Asia and Greater Mekong, and there are even ways to work in those smaller groups as well.
Quickly echo the speakers here. Actually, yeah, there are so many different standard setting bodies to address different topics, but typically for Taiwan, the Taiwanese government is very actively seeking to participate CPTPP, whereby the digital trade is one of the major chapters that we do see there are good chances to be, you know, embrace digital economy. And in terms of the privacy, you know, Thomas mentioned regarding the GDPR, and then there is a framework, which is the APEC cross-border privacy rules, EBPR, that is, you know, being, you know, promoted across the Asia-Pacific APEC region. So I mean, there are a lot going on, and we do see the need for more discussion, and in order to embrace the open economy in the digital age.
Thank you so much. I wish we had more time to go at the, you know, to follow some of the threads and insights that you shared, but we're nearing the end. So. Thanks, Mike. If we have some time, actually, yeah, that would be great. I would love to. We talked about upskilling and reskilling. I think Asik Jean, you mentioned the importance of that. So if any of our panelists want to chime in, then go ahead. Otherwise, we can transition. Okay. Okay, great. So then we'll see, yeah. Are there any takers?
Very quickly, Sujana, very quickly. You know, just to put a little bit of flavor in that question, when COVID came in, I mentioned to you earlier on that we kind of paused the formulation process because the priority that was given to us to make sure that we help our micro, small, medium enterprises pivot from offline to online. So the very obvious private sector intervention then was we called on the private sector to help us out relative to capacity building. Providing information is important. Many of our micro, small, medium enterprises are afraid of getting into the digital platforms for many reasons. Either it's very expensive, very difficult, so many fake news out there. But when we ask the platforms, the private sector, the banks, the fintechs, they all helped out, providing resource people to make sure that these are now people really we are giving the proper information. They all agreed to our call for help by the private sector, by the public sector. And because of that, we do have a little bit of some feedback that many of those that we help who are in offline, who closed the shop, became, they entered into the platform, into the platform. So those are really something that are for real, something that we can say that private sector did. They did it. They provided resources and capacity building. Also, Amazon, by the way, Amazon included. I should also put in a little bit of word for Amazon, because we wanted also our experts to really look into the U.S. market, and Amazon was there to provide and handhold all of our those who are in the micro, small, medium, who are mostly exporters and there. So the private sector really did help government in that particular aspect.
Thank you, Jean, for the nice word. And actually, yes, Amazon Web Service does have many programs, starting from providing educate program to high school students, to university students, collaborating with the university professors to enable both the professors and then students. And then for those are working, then we work with the Ministry of Labor to enable or upskill, reskill the workforce. And then that's the general training. And then for verticals, say for example, the fintech space, we also provide training programs to fintech startups. And we also have a startup program in some of the cities in the north and in the south to provide training to the startups. So, and also some other government organized programs. So, you name it. Actually, there are a lot of capacity building and resources being offered to the private sectors. But having said that, actually, we also provide a lot of capacity building to the government sector, such as Financial Supervisory Commission. We provided 6-month-long training to the financial regulator as an example, together with other cloud service providers. So there are plenty of activities going on, provided from the private sector to the public and also to the governments.
Thank you so much. That's actually great to hear.
Sure. I think Sujana will be back and join us again in a bit. But I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our great panelists, Assistant Secretary Jean Pacheco, Philippa, Cynthia, and Thomas. Thank you so much for your generosity of your time and for sharing with us your experience and great perspectives during this session. My name is Ryan Evangelista, and I'm the Site Philippines Country Director, and I'm pleased to, close out and wrap up this session with some remarks. Again, to our panelists, thank you for being an inspiration to us in our work to strengthen public-private dialogue and policy analysis to enable an ecosystem for entrepreneurs to operate and harness the power of the digital economy around the world. I'd also like to thank the Taiwan Internet Governance Forum for this opportunity for us to host this session. As our panelists found the opportunities to drive business success amid the challenges of digital transformation. Thus, businesses can be supported in reorienting their mindset and capacities to be more resilient. This underscores the value of public-private engagement as a driver for business model reorientation, particularly in supporting micro and small medium enterprises. In undertaking public-private dialogues, it is inevitable to have broader understanding of the risks, the capacity, and the needed policy interventions to support a more structured and seamless digital economy that underscore digital inclusion. Engaging the private sector, the government, civil society encourage a whole-of-business approach to resiliency, where digital transformation serves as a means and not necessarily the end. As such, we must be mindful of the following thrusts in supporting digital transformation among enterprises. First is to engage micro and small medium enterprises, as our panelists mentioned earlier, particularly their owners and leaders as primordial partners. We need to establish contact points or digital contact points for enterprises to become self-aware of their business model needs and transformation agenda. The discipline of business continuity and opportunities with digital transformation should go hand in hand with this. We also need to enforce the e-commerce ecosystem where private sector, civil society, and government drive advocacy and policy dialogue for ease of doing business and business enabling environment. Some illustrative agenda can be internet transactions policy, cybersecurity, data privacy, e-commerce infrastructure, consumer protection, taxation, business registration, licensing, intellectual property, and trade facilitation, among others. We also need to expand digital platforms catering to industry investment, innovation linkages, and market opportunities for enterprises. Linking digitalization with the overall policy framework of ease of doing business and business enabling environment lead to setting the foundation for a level playing field, and we'll be able to harness opportunities brought about by the growth of digital economy such that we will be able to advance a whole of government policy agenda and provide recommendations for regulatory quality and coherence, standards, and market-oriented policy reforms that encourage more inclusive infrastructure and participation in digital economy. We also need to look into fiscal and non-fiscal incentives, where governments can take into consideration targeted incentives using policy tools such as investment priorities plans with the goal of integrating packages to push for, or investment in packages, to push for digital inclusion in various sectors, particularly focusing on supporting technology innovation, R&D, and other initiatives such as improving the supply chain management. There's also a need to look into digital infrastructure where governments working with the private sector can set up the proper infrastructure to support equitable platforms for digital transformation. Our speakers also underscored the value of skills training with the private and public sector stakeholders taking proactive initiatives to boost skills in digital services and technologies. Working with technical vocational education training institutes is vital to support this upgrading of skills. Finally, a local supplier development program will also help us address the current supply chain issues that we have. And this would also encourage micro and small medium enterprises, including indigenous enterprises, in filling in the gaps of the supply chain through their participation in the digital economy. We also need to underscore the whole approach, or that our policy approach gives more support and protection for consumers. Basically, we all work in the same space of ensuring that our activities and business model provide a regime of protection and strengthening regional standards that will help address issues that our consumers face when they transact online. At the end, the speed of digital transformation cannot come at the expense of risk, or the entire initiative can cause more harm than good. It's critical that all the risk factors should be considered to design and implement digital transformation tools, initiatives, and policies, so this new process does not weaken the overall risk profile of enterprises in the digital economy. In this regard, CYPE continues to develop tools and programs to support our stakeholders to navigate and support an enabling environment for digital economy. We're happy to share 2 online tools that we have developed in the last few years on creating an enabling environment for digital economy and harnessing the power of the digital economy, a guide to SMEs digital transformation. You can all access these resources for free on CYPE's websites at www.cype or cipe.org. On that note, I would like to again extend our deepest appreciation to our panelists, to my colleagues at SIPE, especially Sujana and Kathy, for all their hard work and contribution to making this session a huge success. I wish you all a pleasant day, and please stay safe wherever you are. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ryan, Sujana. Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Okay, thanks.